Hi, this is Rabbi Rami Goldberg, and welcome to Biblical Money, powered by Israel 365, where we take a deep dive into how people of faith enhance their business by staying true to their biblical principles. We interview leading CEOs, executives, and entrepreneurs to capture their wisdom to help us live our most fulfilled and faithful lives. Please like and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date and informed. Hi, and welcome back to another edition of Biblical Money. I am Rabbi Rami Goldberg over at Israel 365. I'm joined by a leader in the space talking about bringing God back into the boardroom, which we spend so much time, but bringing God really just back into our lives. We have Troy Miller, who is the CEO of NRB, which is the National Religious Broadcasters. So any Christian media that's out there that you see is all under his auspices. So Troy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
NRB. So I think it's just an amazing thing. And it's crazy just until I started with Israel 365 about a year ago, I never heard of NRB, but I guess you don't have too much Jewish programming on there. But you really set the stage as far as a lot of the messaging that is out there. So just tell us a little bit about what it is that you guys do and what your mission is.
Yeah, a couple of different things that we do. One of them is the NRB has been around for 80 years now as the chief advocate, leading advocate for anybody who's in Christian communications, Christian broadcasting in particular, radio, television. Of course, today we have all of the digital communicators. Churches are into, broadcasting, streaming, everything that's sort of out there. And we advocate on their behalf for all of or any legislation that might be coming through that would affect anybody who's in Christian communications. We work with the regulatory agencies here in the U.S. about any kinds of regulations that would be coming through. And then we also just keep on the landscape of what's going on the whole legal side, what's moving through the court systems. And our goal is to keep Christian broadcasters and communicators in the marketplace and be able to operate their organizations as efficiently and effectively as they can. So that's one of the big things that we do. So, of course, we have offices in Washington, D.C. Then the other thing we do is help them also as the market changes and things change, we help them innovate, keep up on the latest trends in technology, what's going on in business operation and organization, what are the latest management techniques, human resources, you name it. We do a lot of that throughout the year, but we do that also through our annual conference that we do, the largest conference held for Christian broadcasters and media. We do that. Next year will be February. We'll be down in Dallas, Texas area.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so it's a great time of bringing everybody together.
So it's amazing. I mean, it's just like a personal thing, but I know growing up, there was certain words and things that were not talked about on television, and that has changed dramatically. There were certain words, certainly I know that my mother would never let us say, and now it's like, oh, okay, it's said on air all the time. So what do you see as far as like kind of the changes? And everyone says freedom of speech, but they forget that there's, kind of a moral and ethics behind that.
Yeah, there is a moral and ethics behind the freedom of speech. The courts have never recognized it as being just an all-out, anything goes you can do out there. But you're right, we're a long way. When I grew up, there was a famous comedian, George Carlin, and he did a skit one time on, I think it was the 7 words that will get you banned from television, and the FCC used to have a decency division that actually looked at what was going on over the airwaves, both television and radio. And as you said, we've come a long way for that. Those regulations still exist, but nobody enforces them. Nobody really follows through with them anymore. It's really a kind of a broader look at society itself, how society has changed. There was a time when that would you would say one of those words and you would get thousands of calls into the Federal Communications Commissions, people saying, hey, did you hear what, happened on TV? That's terrible. I'm offended. Today, you may get several hundred calls if one of those words come in, or may not any calls at all. It's really a sad look at what's gone on in society today. And I don't think that, that's that old saying, does the culture go first or does, the regulations go first? But it is a sad state of where we're at.
Yeah. I just look at the different mediums, and obviously some of them fall under the FCC and some don't. But, as a parent of children, it's certainly something we're very sensitive towards these things. I don't speak this way in my house, and all of a sudden you're flipping on something which is certainly not within keeping of our biblical values, the parts that we share. So.
Yeah, that's tough. It's tough for parents today. It really is, because as you said, you only had to control the one medium, maybe television or radio, and they were kind of on your side. But today, with all of the different opportunities for streaming and, with kids having cell phones or, internet access on tablets or other devices here, now you really have the wild, wild west out there, because the FCC doesn't control the streaming platforms, and the Federal Trade Communication, which is supposed to look over those, there really hasn't been a lot of help for parents out there today either. So there are a couple of things working through here in the U.S. that are trying to help parents, but it's a tough world today to raise children.
It's definitely something where we had on a certain platform, and I don't want to call anyone out at this point, but I was surprised. It was a music platform, and all of a sudden they have videos, and because it's technically labeled as a podcast rather than a song, so really anything goes. But a sad state of where we're at. But a lot of what we do here, just to go through, I'd love to hear you were in business. You worked at Gateway for a number of years before you kind of went into kind of advocacy and nonprofit work. But love to hear a little bit about, Bible in the boardroom and, some of the things that maybe you wrestled with, earlier in your career.
Yeah, it really is, because, I started off, I grew up in Nebraska, kind of a poor farm kid, really mostly raised by my grandparents, which actually turned out to be a really good thing, because my grandparents held to kind of some deeper values, than growing up in the 60s and 70s as a young kid and a teenager, parents didn't quite hold to those same values. But, then moved into the Navy, and the Navy was great for me. I spent 5 years in the Navy, provided a lot of structure. And at that point in time, the Navy was a pretty solid, organization, the U.S. military was. And that came out of there, as you said, went into business. So the Navy, I worked on a lot of electronic stuff. So the technology world was my world, and ended up working for this little computer company at the time called Gateway, which grew into this $9 billion global company. And over my career, ran a number of things for them: tech support and manufacturing, and finally, global IT. But, back then it's really interesting, because this is in the 90s. Organizations were very concerned, very focused on the business and what the business was about, and how to reach your consumers, and how to, come out with your product lines, all of those things you think businesses would be focusing on. But in the boardroom, being one of the executives there, we did talk about the charitable aspect of what we did as a company, but very focused on the community. How do we help the communities that we're in? We had several locations, and so we worked with a number of organizations. One of the organizations that I really sponsored was Missing and Exploited Children. We helped them out. It was a group that really is focused on just that, finding children who have been abducted, either by strangers or sometimes even by a non-custodian parent. And we helped them out. We provided them with a lot of computers, remanufactured computers. Really focused on that. Focused on some charities with the YMCA and the Catholic, but they were very focused on those kinds of things. And it really does take an advocate within that boardroom, that structure, to get that going, because it's not first and foremost on people's minds there. But it was good, and people got involved with that. And then we got involved with the local charities, homeless people and homeless centers, and we encouraged employees to volunteer time. So it's been a great career doing those kinds of things.
But from Gateway, I mean, you're down in Silicon Valley, which, as you talked about, coming out of the 60s and 70s, and people probably, kind of your age, God is somewhat missing from kind of front and center. Did you feel that as a Christian, that was something where there were questions that came up, ethical questions that kind of pushed you in one way or another?
Yeah, not necessarily like ethical questions in the business. I felt like, at least in the 90s, the businesses were still, pretty focused on, and ethics held a high, value within the organizations. But God wasn't exactly there, but he wasn't pushed out either. I think 20 years later now, we're in a different time, but in the 90s, it wasn't hard to get people to, in an organization, to sponsor, like, the local Christian, homeless center, or to sponsor, programs that were going on through Catholic Charities or different organizations. It really, that wasn't a big issue for people to do, but it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't the first or foremost thought in their head. And as a Christian in a secular company, definitely kind of, you feel a little bit like the outsider. Sometimes you get labeled the label. Sometimes they say, "Oh, Troy's going to talk. That's the religious guy. He's going to talk about something and some charity there." But look, we're called to do that. We're not called to be quiet. Our faith is never to be held in our house of worship only, right?
Yeah, no, it's definitely something. It's definitely something that very often we think that someone's going to, if we hold our principles up, that, oh, we're going to be penalized. But very often people will be much more respectful, and people will not want to speak. We talked about the seven words that'll get you thrown off of TV or whatever it might be. But that's something where, if you show that respect and you live by your principles, very often the people around you do not speak in that kind of very vulgar type of way, because it's like, oh, you're a man of God. You're someone that represents godly values, and that is definitely something that comes up.
Oh, absolutely. Even today in certain settings, if people sort of know who you are and what you do and what your values hold, somebody will let one of those words slip, and then they'll be like, oh, I'm sorry, and it's interesting. In a different setting, that would just kind of pass through and nobody would notice at all. But again, I think it's all about us living out, our faith in the public sector, whether we're working for ministries or whether we're in, secular organizations or organizations that have no religious aspect to them. It doesn't mean we leave our faith at home or we leave it in our, house of worship. We take it with us. And as you said, it's often surprised me about, even in today's world, which I think is more hostile to a faith message, it's often surprised me how people are refreshed when somebody talks and speaks up about their values and the morality that they hold.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have a term called, as Jews, called bageling. And it's like when you notice a Jew across the room, neither of them are, you're not wearing a kippah, you're not wearing a head covering, or so you're not obviously Jewish, and you're kind of trying, but it's kind of like, what kind of keywords do you throw in to know that, okay, we're connect with other types of people. So lox and bagels is one of the traditional Jewish foods. I don't even know where it comes from, to be honest, but I think it was like a Lower East Side, of New York type of thing. But so in your role now, I guess, as within NRB, you probably have like a lot of ability to push push God messaging, across different mediums. I'm curious about the younger generation. What is it that you guys see? We talked about it's difficult to raise kids today's day and age, but what do you see as far as bringing more of a message of God into kind of the everyday, schools and kids and growing up? And again, not forcing religion per se, but certainly a God consciousness, I think we can all agree on.
Yeah, I think you're right. The unique thing about NRB, so after leaving, Gateway, then worked for a media ministry. That's what really got me started in D. James Kennedy, and they did radio and television and got into the early internet, and then came over to NRB TV, and then finally to NRB. And NRB being an organization, being an association, so our over 1,400 members, you get to meet with a lot of unique ministries and people out there. And so young adults today, I think even really around the world, I think one of the really neat things today is the connectiveness that we have that really hasn't existed in history before, because you can be, online talking to people in multiple countries, multiple time zones, all at the same time. And so that's a really neat aspect, but it's created some challenges too, because we find that a lot of young adults really don't have the same sense of identity growing up that maybe a lot of us did, either identifying as let's just say as an American or an Israeli or a German or whatever, because they feel there's such a more global kind of sense of things, and the same thing with their faith. But talking to a lot of the ministries, especially the ones that work with young adults and some of the work that I've done, there's still a hunger there that they have for the truth. We kind of always see the extremes in the media, and we think that maybe young adults are all turned off about faith. It's really not true. They really do want to have conversations about faith. They're very curious, and I find very few of them that are, like I said, just completely hostile. Like, I don't want to talk about that. Don't force your religion on me. That's really not normally the response. That's kind of the activist kind of people. But the everyday let's say under 35 person, when you start to talk about religion and or just your faith, your own personal faith journey, for the most part, they really want to hear what you have to say. They want to know. They're really very curious, and I think that's a good sign.
Yeah, I do think it is interesting, though, as you talk about being on the extremes. Again, mainstream media doesn't really depict, let's say, America. America is predominantly a Christian country, right? And you have 80 million evangelicals, not to mention the Catholics and others. Jews are a statistical minority, but but if you look at anything within your pick your mainstream media, there's no talk of, there's no representation of 1 in 6. Let's just say 1 in 6 or 1 in 5 Americans are evangelicals, and it's not there. So it's I think to your point.
Yeah, exactly. The mainstream media and the entertainment industry today really does not reflect society in America. I actually had somebody, I was traveling a few years back in Thailand, and there was a person that I was talking to had been to America, and they were shocked because their first time coming to America, they thought America was what they saw in the movies and what they heard on media, and they were like, oh, the American people were so nice, and people were friendly, and people, the food was good, all the basic stuff. And they were like, there was definitely two different kinds of country. And I've experienced that going around the world. You often see that countries that are portrayed, stereotyped in entertainment or media are not the same as the people that are in those countries at all.
I mean, I could speak of that firsthand, right? Being here in Israel, it's
right.
We're in the middle of a war right now, and there definitely are hot button locations, but things always that the media certainly tries to drill down on those really tough situations.
Yeah, and my experience in my 2 trips this year to Israel, they try to act like the media tries to that there's all this divisiveness and in the society, and it's really not. You get into Israel and you find out that there are Arabs and Muslims and different people that are living together side by side and in harmony, and that's not it's not at all what the media tries to portray it. And people are very friendly to one another and respectful of one another. We always have, the outliers, but for the most part, that's the real society that doesn't often get shown. And that's, I think, back to kind of looking at this show, that's one of the problems in the boardrooms today, where they're either hearing from nobody or they're only hearing from one side, and so one side gets into the boardroom, and starts to talk about all of this and villainizes the other side. And then you see corporations, all of a sudden get involved in social issues or politics that they wouldn't maybe normally get involved in. And what we're finding in NRB, one of the things that we're working very hard on is to get into the C-suites and the corporate boardrooms across the country, so we can, talk about those 80 million consumers, 80 million people that are in this country that really hold faith very dear to them. And we talk about that from all all different religious aspects, but that's we often find, again, the C-suites are very open to those conversations. It's not like, I don't want to have that conversation.
Yeah, there's a lot more that people want to have. Do you think there's any way to kind of solve what happens in media? A negative headline is going to be so much more powerful. Death, destruction. Oh my gosh, everything is falling down. It gets 10 times the amount of views as compared to, hey, by the way, someone did this amazing act of kindness.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. And media drives on sensationalism, which drives eyeballs, which drives advertising dollars, right? That's the kind of business model that's going on there. So it's sort of a, self-perpetuating, defeating sort of thing. But I do think there are some really neat things going on. First of all, I think there's the rise today of interpersonal communications, back to that best time to communicate, where people are starting to say, hey, I'm going to listen to individuals more than I'm going to listen to mainstream media or legacy media out there. I think people are figuring out that mainstream media are not really the journalists that they used to be of old, that they're a lot more opinion and propaganda kind of organizations, or like you said, like we talk about, sensational. So I'm really encouraged by some of the numbers that I see of people who are not getting their news or getting their opinions from mainstream media. And, like the work you're doing at Israel 365, that people are listening to different voices and going to direct, say, maybe it's better that I actually listen to somebody who lives in Israel than somebody who lives in New York City or wherever about what's going on in Israel. So I do think we live in a great time where that's very hopeful, that people still want to hear the truth and are starting to seek it out more.
Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting. I remember going to a TED Talk actually in Tel Aviv a number of years ago, and they said in every major way, the world has gotten better in terms of life expectancy and general health and less kids starving and on and on and on. The only thing that we're really going down in is happiness, because and he went on to talk negatively about media and how it kind of feeds, it's this junk food diet. That's really what it ultimately is, because and the question is just doing something about it. I always like to take some action. I always like to be more positive. Just that's kind of how I like to function within this.
No, I was going to say I agree with that. I'm generally a much more optimistic than pessimistic kind of person today. So I like to focus on that, and I really do. I think, like you said, there's a surface kind of layer that seems very pessimistic, very kind of, dysphoria, and very, very depressed. But I think underneath that, there's a lot of life teeming, just waiting to kind of get out. But I do see hopeful, and I see a lot of that in the younger adults, in the way that they are communicating on social media within their friend groups. I recently saw a study that said something like, in any of us individually, and I think I'm going to get the number pretty close here, but we really have within our networks, we have about 600 to 700 people that we can influence, and direct influence is 10 times stronger than indirect influence. So if I or you say something to our networks, it's going to hold a lot more weight and importance than if they just hear it on off of a news channel or some other area. And so seeing people become more responsible in their communication there, I think is very, very helpful and very hopeful about the future.
Right. That's good, and I love the optimism, and thankfully my kids, I try and keep them off of social media even as they get older. I've tried to instill within them that it's not valuable. I myself have gotten off of most social media, meaning any of the kind of like, here's an idea that I throw out. No, I'll put something on a WhatsApp group to my friends, but that's very different than just kind of projecting my opinions. So I wanted to ask you just a little bit about NRB. What are some of the things that you do maybe differently than is potentially done in kind of a for-profit world? You kind of have this mission driven on the one hand. You have a little bit more flexibility with regard to God in the boardroom, et cetera. So curious to hear what you guys have done differently.
Well, I mean, first of all, God drives a lot of what we do here. So we do have more opportunities. So you may see people praying, around people studying their Bibles in their workspaces, or getting together in the break room and doing things. And of course, we have the opportunity to pray for one another and, talk about those things. So those are, I think that probably sets us apart from most, commercial organizations that are, more business focused and profit focused in what we're doing. But I think also just looking back on business experience, I think one of the things that I know I've always done and always had it when I've been in a role of leadership is also treating adults like adults. I find that a lot of people in the business world, look at kind of their employees almost, treating them, I guess no other way to say it, like kids, lots of rules and follow the rules. People kind of, I always have the opinion people know what's expected of them for the most part. I mean, you need to communicate that, but they know what needs to get done. And they also, we try to balance personal life with work life. I think that's what I'm trying to say here. So we understand that there's family commitments and people want to be at their kids, games or programs or other events. So I think we work very hard here at balancing that family and work environment there. So it's not all work.
Yeah, no, and it's definitely, it's interesting in terms of praying. So when we pray with ideally we pray with 10 men. And so that's always a question of like, okay, closing the door, can you get a couple of people together? But even that is kind of like you go into a separate room. And what I found actually in being involved with the Christian community, people will say often either, Rabbi, can you pray for me, or can I pray for you? You're in Israel, things are happening. Can I pray for your family? And I think it's a beautiful thing to say, oh, let's stop for a moment and just think about God in this particular moment.
Right.
As we're conducting our business, conducting our lives, and having those stop points. And the more we conduct ourselves in that way, the more we definitely hear God's message on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, exactly. The less we compartmentalize God, the more God is in our lives. That's we just have a tendency to do that. But I think we have the advantage in the Christian side, as you said, to just be able to do that. So
I think one of the Hasidic sages say, where can God be found? Anywhere you'll let him in.
Yeah. So amen. That's a great, yeah.
It's a very powerful line, right? I mean, how often do we make room? Do we make room for God? So as far as certainly talked about some of the challenge opportunity. What's some of the things that you're really excited for? Kind of next step in seeing NRB, next step in terms of like where you think you can expand to, and how you can have an impact, as we talked about, on some of these other mediums that have been kind of pushing in a much more challenging direction.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm really excited because, like I said, I think we live in the greatest time of communication in the history of mankind, and there's just so many opportunities out there, and it's so easy to do. You can communicate. All you have to do is have your cell phone, and heck, most of the world has one of those. And so we live in that time to do it. People just need to be intentional about it. But we're seeing, so many new ministries, so many new communicators come up. We have this whole idea of influencers out there, and now we're seeing a lot of faith influencers on some of the other social media platforms, especially some of them that have like you said, a pretty bad reputation for the content that they have out there. And so that's really exciting to me to see a lot of new energized young communicators getting up, using the mediums that they've grown up with to communicate their faith and to get involved in the public square. For NRB, I think we're very excited to continue our push into the corporate boardrooms and the corporate C-suites. That's a big initiative for us, is to get out there and represent, the evangelical broadcast world, communication world, and maybe even the evangelical world in general, to those people that are of influence and power in corporations that are, making decisions only based on hearing one side of the story. And so that's another area of very encouraging for us, an initiative we have going forward. And then the last one is to be more vocal and on the mainstream media platforms, and just taking on those messages directly. We are working very hard to counter these stereotypes that the mainstream media has put out there about people of faith, and whether we do mostly evangelicals, but we're also been doing a lot with our brothers and sisters in Israel and the Jewish faith, and talking about the relationships there. And so while the mainstream media might try to stereotype the different groups, we're trying to say, here's what's really going on. And guess what? Christians and Jews work together really well, and we have a lot of common ground we're working on. And so that's the areas that we're really focused on, that addressing and attacking those counter messages in the mainstream media, and getting into those boardrooms, those corporate C-suites, to let people know who the 80 million evangelicals are in this country.
Yeah, and it's that's just evangelicals, but there's many more God-believing people, whether Catholics and Jews, and so there are many other people that would want to see that kind of programming as well.
That's right.
So. It's I think that does speak to kind of some of the challenges of making sure that it's done correctly, and it's again not pushing too much of an agenda in one direction or the other, but there just should be kind of a return to wholesomeness within our programming, and wholesomeness and faithfulness within a lot that we're doing. So I just know as a kid, every time there would be a Jew on TV, meaning not the actor, but someone depicted, we're like, oh, let me look. Is that something that I would say represents me, represents my community, and the like.
Right.
And so. Stereotypical big nosed Jew over here, or greedy, but these other stereotypes. But anyway, wonderful. So I just if I guess we're going to be wrapping up. Do you have a favorite Bible teaching with regard to how you conduct your business, or something to share in that regard?
Well, look, in Romans, for us in the New Testament, in Romans 13, Paul talks about us, living out our faith, not conforming to the world, but transforming our minds, to the things of God. And that is something I think we have to always be conscious about, especially when we work in, secular companies, commercial companies. We have to remember we don't leave our Christian values, our morals, our ethics, our principles behind. We take them with us wherever we go, and we live them out. And I think that's one of the things that's always been important to me, and really a guide for how we move forward as leaders wherever we are, and especially as Christian leaders or Jewish leaders. The Old Testament calls us to do the same thing, to live out our values in life, and that's so important to us.
Yeah, amazing, and it's so true. We just have to bring it out, and again, the more that it's out in the public sphere, the easier it is for us to conduct ourselves in that way. So.
That's right,
Troy. I cannot thank you enough for taking the time, and I know you're very busy. Looking forward to seeing you in Dallas in a couple of months, and so thank you for all that you do, and looking forward to continuing to collaborate I know that we have a strong collaboration between our organizations, and may it only continue to be a blessing unto God and to this world.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me today. And the same thing, look forward to seeing you in February, if not sooner, in Israel. But for all the work that you guys do, keep it up. We're praying for you, and just let you know we're praying for, especially for all the people in Israel during this time right now. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. I appreciate that.